ready to dive in. Today, we're cracking open Conrad Riker's Riotous Evolution.
Ooh, good choice.
This book, it takes a look at riots, but not just, as those bursts of chaos and anger we often see on the news. It goes deeper, way deeper, exploring the biological, the psychological, even the social sides of these events.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how Riker connects riots throughout history. Like, he suggests they aren't just these isolated things, but a recurring pattern of human behavior. And get this, he even argues that rioting, it might have evolutionary roots.
Evolutionary roots. Hold on, are you saying there's a riot gene hidden in our DNA? That's a new one.
Haha, not quite a riot gene, but... Well, Riker suggests that rioting might have served as, like, a survival mechanism way back for early humans. Think about it. Banding together to fight off a threat or to secure resources. That kind of collective action, even if aggressive, could have been key for survival.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. Survival of the fittest, right? Strength in numbers.
Exactly. And that instinct, it's still with us today.
So how does this ancient urge to riot, this survival instinct, how does it play out in today's world?
Well, Riker argues that this inherent impulse, it can be triggered when people feel a deep sense of injustice or oppression. When their needs are ignored, their voices aren't being heard.
Right, like a pressure cooker. Things build up, and then boom.
Exactly. It's like a social pressure valve. Things reach a boiling point.
So it's not just raw anger, it's about feeling powerless, ignored, unheard.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even ancient civilizations, they understood the power of a good riot. Riker points out that the Romans, for example, they used riots to demand rights and reform.
Oh, the Romans.
Yeah.
So riots have been a tool for social change for centuries. I guess that makes sense, though it still seems like a pretty drastic measure.
Oh, it definitely is. And we can't forget, riots are often violent and destructive, right? Now, this deep dive, it's not about condoning violence, but it is about understanding those complex forces behind social change.
Right. Understanding the why behind the chaos. Now, Riker also digs into the psychology of riots, right? That idea that a crowd can take on a life of its own, almost become a single entity.
Absolutely. He talks about this concept called de-individuation, where people in a crowd, they can lose their sense of individual identity, their individual responsibility. It makes them more likely to do things they wouldn't normally even consider.
The old mob mentality. People get caught up in the moment and their own personal morals, they just kind of vanish.
Exactly. And Riker used the example of the 2021 U.S. Capitol riot. He argues that the media coverage, the frenzy of that moment, it played a role in escalating the situation.
That's a powerful example how individual actions can be amplified in a crowd. It makes me wonder, have you ever felt that pull, that urge to join a crowd, even if you weren't fully on board with the cause?
That's a fascinating question. And I think it speaks to the power of the bandwagon effect, as Riker calls it. There's a psychological element to being part of a group, right? A sense of belonging, a shared purpose, even if it's just for a moment. It makes you think, how susceptible are we to those collective influences?
It does make you think. Now, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about Riker's idea of riots as a social technology. Sounds strange, doesn't it? Calling a riot a technology.
It does sound a bit odd at first, I'll admit that.
But what's he getting at?
Well, what Riker's saying is that riots, they can function as a way to force those in power to listen to grievances. It's like maybe a crude way, but sometimes effective, to make the unheard voices heard.
So, like a last resort. A desperate attempt to get attention.
You could say that. And history is full of examples where this social technology has led to significant changes.
Think about the French Revolution.
The storming of the Bastille. Now, that was a riot for the history books. Exactly. And while it was bloody, chaotic, the threat of more unrest forced those in power to make concessions. Eventually, it led to major social and political reform.
Okay, I see what you mean. So riots, they can be destructive, sure, but they can also be a catalyst for change. But that still begs the question, is violence ever truly justifiable as a means to an end?
That's the age-old question, isn't it? And one that Riker tackles head-on. He presents a balanced view, acknowledging the destruction, but also highlighting the potential for change.
Right, understanding the complexity, not condoning the violence itself. Now, let's zoom in a bit, focus on the evolution of riots, particularly in England. Riker mentions the first recorded riot in England dates all the way back to 1371.
It's remarkable that's almost a century before the famous Peasants' Revolt. Shows how deep riotous behavior runs in English history.
Wow. So riots, they're nothing new. Always been a part of the human experience. But I imagine the reasons behind riots, they've changed over time, right?
Absolutely. Riker uses the Great Fire of London in 1665 as an example. The riots after that, they weren't directed at any group or individual, but at the government for their perceived negligence in handling the crisis.
Collective outburst of frustration, like you're not doing enough to help us kind of situation.
Precisely. It shows how riots can target those seen as failing to meet the needs of the people. And as we move into the 20th century, Riker talks about the Notting Hill race riots in 1958, marking a shift towards racial tensions as a primary driver of riots.
So the nature of riots, it evolves, reflecting those changing social and political landscapes.
Exactly. And this evolution continues today, with social media and technology playing an increasingly significant role.
Speaking of social media, let's talk about that for a minute. It seems like it can be both a catalyst for riots and a tool for calming them down, right?
It's the ultimate double-edged sword. On one hand, social media can be used to spread information quickly, mobilize people, even coordinate actions, like we saw during the 2011 London riots. But on the other hand, it can also counter misinformation, share important updates, even facilitate dialogue and understanding.
Wow, so it's like a megaphone, amplifying both the good and the bad. It makes you wonder, is social media inherently neutral, or is it designed to make us more outraged and conflicted?
That's a great question, and one that Riker really pushes us to consider. He doesn't give a definitive answer, but he challenges us to think critically about the technology we use, how it shapes our perceptions, our actions.
Right, being aware of the influence it has on us. Now let's talk about the economic impact of riot. There's the obvious destruction, the damage to property and infrastructure, which can be devastating. Riker brings up the 1992 LA riots with an estimated $1 billion in damages.
Yeah, the immediate cost can be staggering. But Riker also presents a more nuanced perspective. He proposes that riots can, ironic, stimulate economic activity in the long run.
Hold on, how can something as destructive as a riot stimulate the economy?
It's a thought-provoking point, right? He argues that the reconstruction efforts after riot, they create jobs, boost demand for materials and services, and they can even lead to the revitalization of areas that were neglected before.
Like a forced reboot. A painful, but sometimes necessary disruption that leads to renewal.
It's an interesting way to look at it. Riker wants us to consider that multifaceted economic impact, recognizing it's not always as straightforward as it seems.
Right, always unintended consequence. Now, the big question, the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
How do we manage? How do we prevent riot?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Finding that balance between keeping order and respecting everyone's individual rights.
Riker mentions military intervention often backfires, doesn't he?
It often does.
Yeah.
He argues that sending in the military, it can escalate violence, make tensions even worse, create more problems than it solves. The book suggests that community engagement might be a more effective approach.
So instead of responding with force, we focus on those underlying causes of unrest.
Exactly. It's about building trust between communities and law enforcement, promoting dialogue, and addressing those social inequalities.
Like treating the disease, not just the symptom. It makes sense, but it also sounds incredibly difficult to actually pull off.
Oh, it's a complex challenge, no doubt. But recognizing those root causes, that's the crucial first step.
This has been a fascinating look at riotous evolution so far. It's clear that riots are more than just mindless violence, right?
Absolutely. They're a complex social phenomenon with a long, intricate history, shaped by our biology, our psychology, and the societies we create.
And as we move forward, understanding those complexities is key to building a more just and equitable society, a society where riots become a thing of the past.
Well said. It's about creating a world where dialogue, understanding, and empathy replace the need for those destructive expressions of discontent.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Actually, that social media question you posed earlier, I need to go do some more thinking about that one. It really got me thinking.
Please do. Critical thinking is essential in this world of information overload.
You're telling me. And on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We'll be back in a moment to continue our exploration of riotous evolution. Okay, we're back, ready to dig even deeper into riotous evolution. You know, so far we've been talking about riots in this big, broad sense, like almost like a force of nature. But Riker, he doesn't just stop at those broad strokes, does he?
Not at all. He gets right into the details, looking at specific cases to illustrate his points. One that really stuck with me was his analysis of the 1992 Los Angeles riot.
Yeah, those were intense. The riots after the acquittal of those officers in the Rodney King beating.
It was a pivotal moment, and Riker uses it to dissect all these complex factors that lead to that kind of eruption. He talks about racial tensions, economic inequality, that simmering resentment towards law enforcement. All those things combined, it was like a tinderbox.
So it wasn't just about that one incident, the Rodney King beating. It was years of underlying issues all coming to a head.
Exactly. Riker's point is that to prevent these things from happening again, We have to understand those root causes, those deep-seated societal problems. And he also examines the role of the media in the LA riots, which is particularly relevant today.
Oh, for sure. Back then, that footage of Rodney King's beating, it was everywhere, globally. I remember it being so shocking to see. I can only imagine that added fuel to the fire.
And Riker talks about how media coverage, while important for transparency and accountability, it can also unintentionally contribute to things escalating.
It's like a feedback loop. The more the media covers it, the more intense it gets, and then that leads to even more media coverage.
Exactly. And with social media today, that dynamic's even more pronounced. We talked about that double-edged sword aspect earlier, but Riker really dives into some specific examples, like the 2011 London riots, where social media was used to organize looting, but also to share crucial information during the crisis.
It's amazing how the same tool could be used for such opposite purposes, right? Both good and bad.
Right. It really shows the duality of technology, reflecting both our creativity and our destructive potential. Makes me curious, what role do you think social media plays in shaping public discourse today and in influencing how we behave collectively?
That's a big one, for sure. I think I'm much more aware now of how easily information or misinformation spreads online. It feels like a responsibility to be more discerning, more critical of what we see and share.
Couldn't agree more. Critical thinking is crucial in the digital age, absolutely. Now, changing gears a bit, let's touch on the legal and ethical implications of riot. That side of things doesn't get as much attention, does it?
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the spectacle, the emotion, but there are real consequences for those involved, both legally and ethically.
For sure. Riker gets into the legal ramifications, the potential for charges, damage to reputations, livelihoods, and he explores that delicate balance between keeping order and upholding individual rights. It's a tension that's always there in these situations.
A real tightrope walk for law enforcement, right? Trying to maintain peace while respecting everyone's rights, even those breaking the law.
It is. Riker really emphasizes the importance of community engagement, building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. He argues that being proactive like that can be more effective than simply reacting with force once a riot breaks out.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right?
Right.
Building those relationships beforehand can make a huge difference.
It can. And Riker's book really underscores that point, that we're all part of this larger social fabric. And riots, they're often a symptom of deeper issues that affect everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the causes, the consequences, the historical context. But what about solution? Does Riker offer any concrete ideas for preventing riots in the first place?
He does. He suggests a multi-pronged approach, tackling those root causes of social unrest we've been talking about.
All right, break that down for me. What are those key areas we need to address?
One of the biggest ones Riker points to is economic inequality. He argues that when there's a huge gap between the rich and poor, when people feel the system is rigged, that's when social unrest is most likely to occur.
It's about fairness,
Yeah.
right? Feeling like you're being left behind, that can breed resentment and frustration.
Exactly. And that frustration can boil over into anger and violence, especially when other ways of expressing grievances have been ignored or shut down.
So tackling economic inequality, making sure everyone has a fair shot, that's one prong. What else?
Another key area is political stability, having a government that's responsive to its people. When people feel they have a voice in the political process, that their concerns are being heard and addressed, they're less likely to resort to extreme measures like rioting.
When governments are corrupt, unresponsive, out of touch, people lose faith in the system, right?
They do, and that loss of faith leads to hopelessness, the feeling that the only way to be heard is to make a big disruptive statement.
So a political system that's fair, transparent, accountable, where people feel like they have a stake in things. That makes sense. What about the social side of it? How do social tensions play into this?
That's the third prong in Riker's approach, addressing social tensions, things like racial discrimination, religious intolerance, any kind of prejudice that divides communities and creates fertile ground for unrest.
Right, those divisions make it so much easier for a small spark to turn into a massive fire. So it's about promoting understanding, tolerance, empathy between different groups in society.
Exactly. Building a more just and equitable society where everyone feels heard, respected, valued.
It's a huge task, but it's also inspiring to think we have the power to create that kind of change. Now, taking a step back, let's look at some of those historical examples Riker provides. He takes us all the way back to ancient Rome, showing how riots were used to demand rights and reform. It's amazing to think some of those same patterns we see today were playing out centuries ago.
Right. The parallels between ancient Rome and the modern world are fascinating. It shows that the issues might change, but those underlying dynamics of social unrest, they stay pretty consistent.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, right?
Exactly. And Riker's book is full of those insightful observations. He also digs into the evolution of riots in England, tracing their history back to that first recorded riot in 1371.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier, how he even predates the Peasants' Revolt.
It really shows how deeply rooted riots are in the human experience. Riker walks us through those key events like the Great Fire of London in 1665, which, like we discussed, sparked riots because people felt the government was mishandling the crisis.
Interesting how those riots weren't aimed at any specific group, at the government's perceived incompetence. It seems like a recurring theme throughout history. Riots as a response to leadership failure.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. And as we move closer to the present day, Riker examines how riots in England evolve, reflecting those changing social and political dynamics, like the Notting Hill race riots in 1958, which brought racial tensions to the forefront.
And he brings us all the way to the 21st century, exploring how social media and technology are shaping modern riots. It's that historical perspective I find so valuable. It helps us understand the patterns, the triggers, those underlying currents that lead to these events.
Absolutely. It reminds us that riots aren't isolated incidents. They're part of this bigger tapestry of human history, woven with conflict, with change, with that constant struggle for a more just and equitable world.
Wow, that's beautifully put. Now, switching gears a bit, let's talk about the economic impact of riots. Riker acknowledges those immediate costs, the property damage, business disruptions, strain on resources, like those LA riots in '92, estimated at $1 billion in damages.
Yeah, the financial fallout can be immense, but Riker also pushes us to look beyond that immediate aftermath, to consider the long-term economic effects.
Wait, you mean he's saying riots can actually stimulate economic activity?
He does. He points out that the rebuilding efforts, they create jobs, increase demand for materials and services. They can even lead to the revitalization of areas that were neglected before.
It's like a phoenix rising from the ashes, in a way.
It's an interesting analogy, but it's crucial to remember that this economic stimulation comes at a high cost, financially and socially.
Right. The human toll can't be forgotten. The lives disrupted, businesses destroyed, the trauma inflicted.
Absolutely. Which brings us to that crucial question of managing and preventing riot.
What's Riker's take on that? How do we navigate this?
He advocates for a multifaceted approach, starting with addressing those root causes we've discussed. Economic inequality, political corruption, social injustice. These are the things that breed discontent.
They're like the kindling, just waiting for a spark.
Exactly. And that spark could be anything. A court verdict, a police shooting, an economic downturn. It's about addressing those underlying issues so there's nothing for that spark to ignite.
But what about when a riot is already happening? How do we handle that effectively?
That's where Riker emphasizes finding that balance between keeping order and respecting everyone's rights. He cautions against excessive use of force, saying it often escalates violence and makes things worse.
So, not just cracking down with brute force.
Not at all. Riker advocates for a more nuanced approach, combining law enforcement with communication, de-escalation techniques, community engagement. Those are key.
It's about seeing the people in the crowd as individuals, not just a mob.
Exactly. Understanding those grievances, the frustrations that led to the outburst, and addressing them in a way that respects everyone's dignity.
That's a tough task.
Yeah.
But it does seem more humane and ultimately more effective than just resorting to force.
Agreed. And it brings us back to that importance of empathy, of understanding, and addressing those underlying social and economic conditions.
Wow, this has been such an insightful deep dive. Riker's book really makes you think about riots in a new way. Not just chaotic events, but complex social phenomena with deep roots and consequences.
It does. It challenges us to move beyond those simple explanations and really grapple with the nuance.
He reminds us that riots, while destructive, are often a symptom of something bigger, something in our society that needs attention.
It's a cry for change, a demand for justice, a reflection of that struggle for dignity and equality.
And as we face the challenges of the 21st century, understanding those underlying currents is crucial if we want to build a more just and peaceful world.
Absolutely. A world where riots aren't a necessary evil, but a fading memory of a time when we failed to meet the basic needs of our citizens.
That's a powerful thought. We'll be back in a moment to wrap up our deep dive into riotous evolution and explore what the future might hold for this complex and ever-changing phenomenon. Okay, we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into riotous evolution. We've covered so much ground, the history, the psychology, the impact, but what I find really intriguing is Riker's look ahead. He doesn't just dwell on the past, he's trying to understand what the future holds for riots.
Yeah, you're right. That's what makes this book so unique. He goes beyond analyzing what's already happened and dives into what might happen, how riots could evolve, shaped by globalization, tech advancements, all those shifting political landscapes.
Let's put on our future predicting hats for a minute. What's Riker's take? What does he see in store for the future of riots?
Well, one prediction that really stands out is the rise of what he calls digital riots, protests and unrest that are mainly organized and coordinated online through social media, messaging apps, all those digital tools.
We're already seeing a bit of that now, right? Social media is a huge part of social movements these days.
Absolutely. And as technology keeps advancing, as we become even more interconnected, Riker believes those digital riots could become even more sophisticated, more widespread.
So imagine protests erupting in multiple cities at the same time, all planned through encrypted messages and social media. It's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Exactly the kind of scenario Riker paints. And it raises some tough questions about how governments and law enforcement will adapt.
It's like we're entering this whole new era of protest, where the battle isn't just on the streets anymore. It's in the digital world, too.
That's a great point. It highlights the need for new strategies for managing and preventing these kinds of riots. Those traditional methods might not cut it in this new landscape.
Riker also mentions the possibility of riots becoming more localized, more targeted, right?
Yes, he suggests that as societies become more fragmented, more divided, we could see an increase in riots focused on specific issues within certain communities.
So instead of those huge citywide riots, we might see smaller, more focused outbreaks, targeting specific institutions or policies.
Exactly. And that could make it even tougher for authorities to respond effectively because they'd need to really understand those local dynamics, the specific grievances at play in each community.
It seems as responding to those hyperlocal riots would require a much more nuanced approach, prioritizing communication, de-escalation, community engagement, like Riker suggests.
Absolutely. A one-size-fits-all approach won't work in such a complex and diverse environment.
It's fascinating, this future Riker lays out. Both exciting and a bit daunting. Like, we're on the verge of this whole new era of social unrest, shaped by globalization, technology, and human behavior.
It's a time of huge change and uncertainty, for sure. But it's also a time of great opportunity.
Opportunity? In what sense?
Well, Riker argues that by understanding how riots are evolving, what causes them, how they're changing, we can develop better strategies to prevent them and manage them when they do happen.
So knowledge is power, right? The more we know, the better prepared we are.
Exactly. By studying the history, the psychology, the social and economic factors, we gain those valuable insights that can inform our responses and help us create a more peaceful and just world.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes. I'm seeing riots in a whole new light, not just as chaotic outbursts, but as complex social phenomena.
I'm glad to hear that. That's the power of learning, expanding our understanding and challenging our assumptions.
Riker's book is a call to action, a reminder to stay vigilant, to understand and address those root causes of unrest.
It is. It reminds us that building a just and equitable society takes constant effort, open communication, and a willingness to face those uncomfortable truths.
Well said. On that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a fascinating exploration of riotous evolution.
It has. And I hope our listeners have gained a better understanding of this complex, ever-changing phenomenon.
Absolutely. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out Conrad Riker's Riotous Evolution.
It's available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
So dive in, explore this fascinating topic further, and keep engaging with the world with curiosity and that critical mind.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning.